Hey there, extra historians. Welcome to Lies, the part of the show we tell you all the things we left out, the stuff we got wrong, and all of the interdictions we excommunicated. I'm Rob, I'm the head writer of Extra History, and today we're here talking about the Pazzi Conspiracy, which, as you can tell, I am very excited about, because I am a big ol' nerd. I love this topic. I'm so glad we finally got to do it. Thank you so much, patrons, for voting for it. If you would like to become a patron, get our episodes a little early, vote and suggest topics and shape the direction of our series, you can head on over to our Patreon. If you want to see, speaking of our next series, the first episode of Unholy Roman Emperor Frederick II, it's up on Nebula right now. We're part of the Nebula Network. And speaking of Nebula, we have mugs now in our Nebula store. We have Worst Dads in History mugshot mugs. This one's Vlad Dracul. It's got a cool two-tone orange and white. This one is Nero as Worst Kids in History. And there's also a Wu Zetian Worst Moms in History. These mugs they work in any weather, as you can see, hot or cold. They're compatible with most major liquids, which took years of research and development. Coffee, tea, water, wine, cocoa, antifreeze. Tests did not go great with that, so be forewarned. But yeah, go pick these up. I would love to make more. If we sell a bunch, maybe we'll get to make some more. The other thing I just can't believe I'm saying is we broke 4 million subscribers over the holidays. Thank you so much. It is mind-blowing to me every day that I see it. I'll be on YouTube and I'll click on something from like a talk show, that has a major presence on TV, and they'll have a third of the subscribers that we do. And that makes me so happy and so hopeful that enough of you are out there that want to learn about history and want to know more about history and just hear historical tales told, that we would have that kind of reach. Thank you so much. I really can't appreciate it so much. And you'll be seeing a little celebration of that pretty soon. Speaking of pretty soon, in the new year, we're going to try a little bit of an experiment. As you know, we've been tinkering a little bit with how we do our episodes, how many episodes we do. We're trying to kind of find a sweet spot for various reasons, and we're going to try a new thing, starting with our next series. There's going to be a community note that goes into more detail on this, so we're actually going to start releasing every other week, but the episodes will be longer. So it's not less content, it's more content every other week. And this is for a variety of reasons. It's like a little more sustainable for the writing and art and recording sides. We don't have to like chop a story up into 4 pieces. It could be a little more of a 3-act structure. I think each episode, now that having written a couple of series with this, feels a little more complete. And also these days on YouTube is trending towards longer videos. And as a result, longer videos, we've noticed, just hook more people. We will often get more views on our longer videos than our shorter ones, but we're going to see if people like it. We'll see what happens. Recommended reading for this series is April Blood, Florence and the Plot Against the Medici by Laura Martinez. I love this book. It's academic-y. It's not so much about the conspiracy itself. It's especially a lot about kind of the intersection between violence and art, and trying to get into like, why were Renaissance Italians just like ripping people apart in the streets? Like, what was going on with this? It's really interesting. The Pazzi Conspiracy, The Plot Against the Medici by Harold Acton. Magnifico, The Brilliant Life and Violent Times of Lorenzo de' Medici by Miles J. Unger. The Medici by Paul Strattern. And Fire in the City, Savonarola and the Struggle for the Soul of Renaissance Florence by Laura Martinez. There's more in the description linked. There are articles and things like that. But I also wanted to give you a Savonarola one. How'd you like the Savonarola episode? And there are some more for that as well. First, I just want to talk about the origins of this series. When I was in early high school, I was part of this group called the Society for Creative Anachronism. It's a medieval reenactment group, and I started to get interested in Renaissance Italy. And originally I was interested in Rome and Venice in particular, because I'd found this book on Venice in my middle school library, and I got fascinated by Venice. But then someone mentioned the Medici to me, and where I went with that was that my grandmother had just given me this set of my great-grandfather's encyclopedias from 1912. And if you've ever seen one of these are just like common as dirt. They're everywhere. You can't even sell them. It's like 26 volumes, right? Each one's about this big, and the font is tiny. And I looked up Lorenzo de Medici, and then I looked up the Pazzi Conspiracy, because that seemed interesting. And from that, it just set my brain on fire, where I was like, I have to like tell this story in some way when I develop a writing career, because I knew I wanted to be a writer for a very young age. And I knew I wanted to write about history. So I was like, I need to make this a historical novel. I need to make this a TV show or a movie or something. Like, I need to tell this story in some format. And I'm really grateful that I finally got to do that. About 2 years after reading those entries and telling everyone who would listen at school about the Pazzi Conspiracy, it's very, very popular. So many parties as a high schooler. This book called April Blood came out and went into, in just exacting detail, this plot. So that was like off. It just heightened my interest even more. In 2020, I was really lucky. Despite the pandemic, the Uffizi Gallery in Florence sent a big group of Botticelli works to Hong Kong in this exhibition called Botticelli in His Times, which included a lot of portraits of people in this series, right? Like Giuliano and Lorenzo are in the Adoration of the Magi. And I got to see that giant, beautiful painting. And I also got to see the portrait of Lorenzo that you always see in like books and stuff with the red headdress was there. Like, I think it's his Wikipedia main picture. And it's so tiny. It's so small. You know, you see these things in books and you kind of just assume they're going to be big. Like when I saw Napoleon crossing the Alps in Austria and in Vienna, you know, you see a whole wall and you're like, God, this thing's enormous. It's amazing. Or like you see the Kiss and you're like, oh, you know, it's like looking at an IMAX screen of a painting. It's so big. Like, but this was so tiny. A guy was standing next to me and I had to like say, please, can you like move your elbow? Because I can't see the painting. Because he was leaning over it slightly. It was like in a display case you like bent down to look at so you could get close to it to actually see it. It's funny when that kind of stuff happens. We had a lot of people asking about Assassin's Creed and Assassin's Creed 2, and I made a decision, and it was for two reasons. The first is I worried that referencing it would take us out of kind of like the dramatic tension that I wanted to create. And I really wanted us to feel invested, just really immersed in this world of Renaissance Florence. And I was like, I don't really want to see Ezio like in the background or like on a building. I think it'll take away from it. It'll pull people out of it. And also I was like, listen, I love that game, but it's getting on the old side. And I think this is kind of more of a footnote than something that people are going to really remember. I was completely wrong. Every other comment on the first episode was about Assassin's Creed 2. So I made the wrong call on that. We should have done Easter eggs with Ezio. Period. I actually was a little mad at the game when it came out. I love that game. It's one of my favorites, actually. But the Pazzi Conspiracy part of it sort of upset me, actually, because I was so excited that I was like, oh, we're going to do it. It's going to happen. And then everything they do surrounding it is great. But the attack happens on the steps of the cathedral rather than inside during High Mass, which to me kind of spoils it. Because that's like the egregiousness of this happening during Mass and this drama of this packed cathedral and the confusion and not knowing like where people are, what's happening, and you know the bank manager getting killed to shield him and shutting the doors of the baptistry. Like, to me, that's like the heart of this and what drives everything else. But I'm sure for technical limitations, they couldn't do like the inside of a cathedral with a big crowd and like it would be very confusing for the player. So I totally understand why they did it, but I was like, oh, I felt so disappointed. But so I was upset how it rendered that, but I love the game as a whole. I think it's fantastic. Someone said, wonderful video, small correction at 740. Archbishop Salviati was the Archbishop of Pisa, not Florence. I'm so happy to see this topic. Yes, you're right. We got it right later in the episodes, I think, but we slipped on that one. When visiting Florence, I toured the Medici Villa. Are there any connections to Lorenzo and the banks today? I'm very jealous. I've been to Italy once, and it was one of those things where you buy a ticket on a Tuesday and you fly on a Thursday, and it's cheaper for that. But as a result, we didn't really plan out our trip. We flew to Rome. We were there for Easter weekend, which was amazing. And we went to the train station to go to Florence, and I was like plotting out my walking tour of Pazzi Conspiracy Massacre sites. And they didn't have any tickets, so we went to Venice instead, which, poor us. Venice is amazing, and I love Venice. But I probably saved my marriage. I'm sure my wife did not want to go to Italy to walk around and look at 500-year-old Medici family massacre sites. But no, there aren't really financial connections anymore. But the artistic legacy is still there. The architectural legacy is still there. The cultural legacy is still there. People still, have very strong feelings about the Medici, and particularly in Italy, as you saw during our Garibaldi series, it's a highly local place. So people really, really identify as being from Venice or Florence, or So their mark is not necessarily a financial one, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Was that a reference to the sickos as depicted by the Onion's editorial cartoonist Kelly? Yes, it is. I love Kelly, and I particularly love the sickos joke. I love that it's become kind of a meme. Everyone loved Matt's Krampus sweater, as they should. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Simonetta Vespucci, because there's some myths that have been built up around her. She was considered the most beautiful woman in Florence. Several paintings are supposedly of her. You'll see these portrait of a woman, parentheses, Simonetta Vespucci. Supposedly she's Botticelli's model for the Birth of Venus model, quote unquote. She was dead by that time. And she's also hidden as one of the divine women that are kind of looking in awe of Venus coming out. Historians have backed off of this. You'll even see this when I went to the exhibition. They had a portrait of a woman and had those parentheses, Simonetta Vespucci, and a whole thing about her. A lot of historians have backed off on this and said that what these are idealized depictions of feminine beauty. And Simonetta Vespucci probably fulfilled a lot of these, right? And because Botticelli had painted her before on Giulio's banner, which is, we don't have anymore, it's now lost, or was not really intended to last, he may have borrowed some elements of her into these, because they are kind of strikingly similar. But the belief is that, she may have influenced these idealized depictions of feminine beauty, but these aren't paintings of her, right? And this kind of story that Botticelli is in love with her, and so he's putting her everywhere. It's a very, very enjoyable idea, but it's probably just not true. Similarly, that Botticelli stopped painting when Savonarola kind of came in and convinced him that these things were terrible that he was doing. That seems not to be true either. He also just was getting old and was not as good as he used to be. His work was kind of just getting pedestrian. So if you see that, this is Simonetta Vespucci, probably not, actually. Speaking of that exhibition, they had the Adoration of the Magi there, which, Lorenzo and Giuliano are in, adoring Jesus. Giuliano was kind of standing there with a sword, as he, should be. But in that he has dark hair, we depicted him with lighter hair. I wanted some visual contrast. I knew there were going to be a lot of scenes of people with daggers. And I wanted him to be able to mark out. It also kind of gets forward this idea of him as a lighter presence and a more charismatic, handsome presence. That's the only painting depiction of him we have. And there is also there's a statue. There's a bust, which I believe was sculpted after he died. But he has this wavy hair Today, we would still consider him pretty handsome. Episode 2, patron question from Bo Carey. Is it true that modern Italian word for crazy is now pazzi? No, it's pazzo. Or pazzo. Yeah, you're not the first person to think that. It's not true, though. Again, like, many myths have built up around the Medici and Botticelli and like this whole period of Florence. So no. Also, there doesn't seem to be any link to Pazzi, which is something else that people asked about in the comments. Someone said, I just love the art and narrative of this story. When Matt describes when Francesco Pazzi murders Giuliano, it makes it sound like Game of Thrones, kind of evil and violent. Yeah, I think I was in early college when they disinterred Giuliano to like do a forensic examination of a skeleton. It bad. Like that was where the detail comes from, that like a dagger penetrated his skull and probably went about like 1.5 inches, 2 inches inside. They really wanted to make sure he was dead. And I've read, various interpretations of this. One that I kind of believe, honestly, is just he was a very talented swordsman and athlete, and I think they were kind of afraid of him. So they really wanted to make sure he was down, and I think spite plays into it too. Like, I think they were just kind of over-killing him. So I think it's a number of things. But yeah, it's a very violent attack, kind of shockingly violent. On top of everything else, it's just horrible, They're not like slitting his throat. They are just straight up butchering this guy. And again, I think that plays into like the intensity of the violence that gets visited on the Pazzi, is the fact that they didn't just kill this guy. They really, really, really messed him up. Patron question from Christina Faline. Why did Francesco limp when he killed Giuliano? Was it out of guilt because he'd killed someone, not just killing them, but killing them in a church? As we mentioned in the episode, Francesco was so viciously attacking Giuliano that he managed to stab himself in the thigh. I think this is probably due to it being in a crowd, right? This is likely happening at very close quarters. There are other people around. When you get to the point where people are panicking and running, maybe he gets bumped and accidentally stabs himself or something like that. But you also have to think about like how bizarre that would be for Lorenzo, right? Just 1 second, this guy has slashed your neck and is trying to stab you, and you're defending yourself and you start running away. And then there's this other guy who's limping toward you, who's spattered head to toe in blood and is bleeding from his own leg and is, has this weird hitching walk. It sounds so terrifying. Someone said it's crazy how similar the close friend convincing the target to go to their own assassination the very day after the target almost cancels because they're not feeling well is to the assassination of Julius Caesar. I wonder how often that has happened in history. Today we think of healthy as our default state, and when we're sick as an aberration. In the past, people frequently kind of considered it the opposite, that you would have these periods of health in between being injured or sick or just generally unwell with a chronic condition that couldn't be managed. I mean, that's how I would live if we didn't have modern medications, right? I have asthma. And I would just be like not able to breathe for like months on end when the allergens were bad. So I don't think there's anything unusual in this kind of happening with Giuliano. There have been historians who have suggested that this is part of like a Medici plot, that they knew that something was going to go on, so they didn't want the two of them together so that they couldn't both be taken out at the same time. I don't really believe that, because I don't think they would have been able to convince him to go out had that been the case. But I think it's more that just he was ill and injured. And I mean, someone who was a very active sportsman at that time would deal with sports injuries, right? So I think that's just what it is. And the city's vengeance was about to fall on the Pazzi. Even if you're killing a tyrant, the public's sympathies tend to go with the victim. Yep. Political assassination is frequently a self-defeating thing. Like, there's a lot of stuff that was probably not politically possible in the Kennedy administration until after the Kennedy assassination happened, and it was like pitched as part of JFK's legacy. So yeah, yes. Someone said, holy crap, that animation genuinely unnerved me. Amazing job on the animation, you guys. Lots of people are talking about how your animation is getting better and better. Thank you. Nick did an amazing job of this, just especially on that episode with the cathedral attack, which at the beginning I was like, we need this to really hit hard. Like, this is, to me, the central event. And it's something that, like, in the game we didn't really get. So I wanted to make sure that really hit hard. Why were people allowed to carry weapons in a church? Weren't these supposed to be left into a designated space? So it's very likely, we depicted these as kind of like long swords, which are more like war swords. These were more likely more like short rapiers, hanger swords, or they're sometimes called. Instead of full war swords like we've shown, think of like a short rapier as like a pistol, whereas a long sword is like a AR-15, right? One's a battlefield weapon. Another is something you might carry around. It's also a status symbol. These were fashion accessories as well as weapons. And both, the Medici and the Pazzi were well-to-do rich families, so they have these status symbols with them. And so but they're dangerous, obviously. Episode 3, patron question from Corey. Rewatching the Urbino episode after this one, it's surprising to see Federico de Montefeltro involved in a plot like this. What was he planning to do if he succeeded in taking Florence? Maybe he'd just take it over, maybe he'd trade it for something, like he'd end up in charge and he'd be like, all right, what are you going to give me for this city? That's my guess. We're not totally sure. His involvement is a relatively recent discovery. I didn't, for example, when I first learned about it, was reading about it in high school and college, we didn't know this. So this is a sort of new revelation. And that's history. We learn new stuff and it changes how we feel about a figure or an era. Or something happens in the modern day that makes us look back on that and feel differently or think differently about it. Because it changes the historical lens that we're looking at. As we talked about last series, different lenses and different theories. At 6:59, this is why we have the word defenestrate, because it happened often enough. This is Salviati going out the window. Yep, great, and what a great word it is too. One possible correction, I'm pretty sure that while Sixtus excommunicated the entire Medici family and the city officials of Florence, he didn't excommunicate the population. Rather, he put them under interdiction, which prevented the sacraments such as mass, weddings, funerals, from being publicly performed in the city. Main difference is that interdiction only applies to the place. You could theoretically go somewhere else and receive sacraments. But clergy could not perform them in Florence. Yeah, that's correct. I don't think this was heavily followed, actually, because as I said, Sixtus was a very contentious pope, even within the church. So you did have, and you'll see that with some of his successors in Savonarola, there was a lot of localism even in the church where you don't necessarily have anyone like listening. So you do have clergy continuing to do stuff in Florence. Episode 4, patron question from Chromic Acid. At 6:18 it says December 29th, 1479, but shows a picture of an older and bearded Leonardo da Vinci, but he was only in his late 20s at the time. Was this an artistic choice? Well spotted. Yeah, it was young da Vinci. It was a little bit of an artistic choice. I mean, he's showing up really quickly, so you kind of want to show like the Da Vinci everyone knows. I can't remember if I did that intentionally. I just let that through intentionally, or that was my reasoning. I just didn't think about it. But yes, it's young Da Vinci. YouTube question 836. Clement VII was the second Medici Pope, not the first, since Lorenzo's son, Giovanni de' Medici, had been Pope Leo X from 1513 to 1521. Wonderful series and very enjoyable. Yeah, I just forgot the order of them, to be honest. Coming up on Extra History, the unholy Roman Emperor Frederick II versus the papacy. This is going to be a really cool series. This is one of the most dynamic monarchs of the later Middle Ages. Some people even consider him like a Renaissance prince that, in general, modern historians are like, no, he was very medieval, but like he does have these kind of emerging, he's a scientist, he's a patron of literature. He's a fascinating guy. He goes on, he leads a crusade while being an excommunicate. Speaking of excommunication, we're going to get a lot of them next series. History of Cats, Fabulous Felines. Just before the break, I finished writing the second episode of this, which is the medieval era where all sorts of very bad things are happening to cats because of witch trials. But the first episode has all this stuff about Egypt and Bast. It's going to be a really enjoyable series. And next week I'm writing the third one, and I can't wait. That's like the Victorian cats, and cats kind of moving into being a very accepted household pet from being essentially a pest. They kind of considered them like almost no better than the rats they were chasing. And then we're going to be voting on an Explorers and Pioneers series. If you want to vote for one of those, join the Patreon. You'll see that pretty soon. It's probably going already. We're going to talk a little bit in a new segment called Rob's Commentary Corner. So I'm the head writer of this show, but it's not my show. You know, someone gave me the writing duties, and maybe it's not what I'm leading towards, but maybe one day I will end up passing them to someone else, right? So I try to be very careful about keeping the voice of the show separate from my personal opinions. But I did want to talk about how I have always really liked the Medici. And it's something about like the romance of like art and violence and politics. And I've always really admired Lorenzo for his diplomatic skills and his ability to get out of incoming wars or to end wars sooner than they might have. But I gotta say, you know, one of the reasons that the Medici have like such a reputation is that a lot of the bad things that they did, and listen, they were a lot less violent as far as like burning towns and stuff than most other Italian families in power at that time. You know, they did some bad stuff, and they were pretty restrictive, especially increasingly after the Pazzi Conspiracy, very restrictive in Florence and in kind of like strangling the Republic. And as you see in Savonarola, people really did not like that. And especially when they come back into power, they are very oppressive, right? I've always kind of like thought Lorenzo was a fascinating figure, but it's not necessarily the family as a whole that I've always liked. But one thing that I've kind of always admired of them is that they were not aristocrats and that they bought their way into power. I have to say, from back when I was in high school and early college to now, as we have more and more participation of very rich people in politics, I'm a little more lukewarm on this idea of like, haha, stick it to the aristocrats, buy your way into power, I'm rich and therefore I can, you know, do what I want. I feel a lot differently about that recently. And, you know, I think because the legacy that has survived is this artistic legacy, we often kind of forget the oppressive legacy because it doesn't really affect us so much in the modern day. And it's made me kind of like look back and reevaluate and think like, maybe this needs to be a little bigger part of the story, right? Which is one of the reasons I put in Savonarola as the next as the next part of this story, because there was this big backlash where they were kicked out of the city. You know, is there a lesson there that like, if you do these great public things, then people will excuse some of the nastier things that you do? Yeah. I mean, a lot of the Gilded Age was that, right? You have these wonderful institutions that get funded by, you know, kind of monopolists and people who are not great to their workers frequently. We talked about Henry Ford. We've talked about Rockefeller. And you do have this other side. You know, I think about that as I took my kids to the Air and Space Museum, right, in DC, which you should absolutely go to because it's a fabulous institution. And, you know, you walk in, one of the first things you see is, you know, Jeff Bezos' name carved into the wall because he gave a ton of money to that museum. And I'm very appreciative of that. It's a great use for tons of money is to support a public institution like that. But at the same time, I'm like, is this like a bit of a modern Medici thing where it's there is this artistic legacy and this kind of humanitarian legacy that is covering up other things that might not be as savory? And yeah, definitely has made me think differently about the Medici. They're not just the kind of artistic, brilliant heroes / kind of fun political operators in the way that like Lord Ventinari, right, is very clearly a Lorenzo analog a little bit in Discworld, mixed with some other Machiavelli's Prince, but he's very Lorenzo. But again, the way that you are experiencing the world now is going to change how you feel about history. I think we should just expect that. See you next time.
I would like to take a minute, so just sit right there, to tell you how Angela Valenciana, Arcalite Games, Dominic Valenciana, Hunter Z, Joseph Blame, Kuya Koi, Lotus Wolf, and Ziliad's Architectures became the best patrons in Bel Air. I mean, the internet.